While my family raised their glasses at my parents' 40th anniversary celebration, I was sitting alone in my office because they had decided my presence would ruin the atmosphere. I sent my father one text: "Hope tonight is everything you wanted." He never wrote back. At 7:40, my phone lit up. A woman from my bank's fraud line spoke in a calm, clipped voice. "Ms. Hollister, can you confirm whether you authorized a charge of $31,000 to the Marigold Pavilion this evening?" I stood up from my chair. "I'm at my office. I haven't authorized anything." She listed the charges one by one: the banquet hall, the live band, the catered dinner, a luxury resort deposit. "Lock it," I said. "Lock everything." Minutes later, the celebration collapsed, and I finally understood exactly who had been stealing from me. If you've ever felt erased by the people who were supposed to love you most, stay with me, because this story goes further than you might expect. And if it resonates with you, subscribing to the channel means you'll never miss the next one. I've always been the one people called when things fell apart. Not because I volunteered, but because somewhere along the way, my family decided that being capable meant being available, and being available meant never saying no. When my parents' furnace broke down in the middle of a winter freeze, I was the one who covered the repair bill. When my brother Colton got himself buried under credit card debt for the third time in 5 years, I was the one who quietly cleared enough of it so he could breathe again. When my mother needed a new roof and my father said the timing was bad for their accounts, I found a way. I never kept score. I told myself that's what family did. You showed up, you helped, and you didn't make people feel small for needing you. My name is Paige Hollister. I'm 36, and I've lived in Spokane, Washington long enough to know which streets flood in March and which coffee shops stay open past 9 on a Tuesday. I work as a senior procurement manager for an infrastructure construction company, which means I spend most of my days negotiating contracts, tracking budgets, and making sure nothing falls through the cracks on projects that cost more money than most people will ever see in a lifetime. I bought my own house at 31. I built my savings from scratch. I kept my credit history clean the way some people keep a garden, carefully, consistently, with real attention to what could go wrong if you stopped paying attention for even a season. My brother Colton is 5 years younger than me and about 15 years behind me in the way he moves through the world. That's not entirely his fault. He's charming, genuinely funny, and the kind of person who can walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new friends and a dinner invitation. But charm doesn't pay invoices, and good intentions don't make up for the pattern of starting things he never finishes. He'd launched a landscaping business that lasted 8 months, an online resale store he abandoned after one slow quarter, and a coffee cart venture that ended when he decided the early mornings weren't worth it. Our parents never pushed back on any of it. To them, Colton was always just about to figure things out. Our father, Douglas, spent more than 30 years as a plant supervisor at an agricultural equipment manufacturer just outside of Spokane. He was the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and took quiet pride in the fact that the line he managed never missed a quota on his watch. He was also a man who believed that a family's reputation was something you tended the way you tended a front lawn, visible to the neighbors, always presentable, never letting anyone see the weeds underneath. My mother, Marlene, felt this even more deeply than he did. She had spent decades building a version of our family that looked exactly the way she wanted it to look from the outside: successful, close-knit, admired. If something threatened that image, she didn't fix the problem. She rearranged the frame. In the weeks leading up to what I didn't yet know was a major family celebration, I noticed people pulling back from me in small ways. Phone calls with my mother got shorter. A Sunday dinner that was supposed to happen in early October got quietly rescheduled and then never rescheduled again. My brother stopped responding to texts the way he normally did, not ignoring me completely, just taking longer, giving shorter answers, keeping things surface level. I noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure before a storm. Something felt different, but I couldn't name the exact thing. I assumed everyone was absorbed in the details of my father's upcoming retirement. Douglas had given nearly his entire adult working life to that company, and stepping away from it was a bigger emotional transition than he let on. I figured the family was rallying around him in ways that didn't require my direct involvement. I was wrong about almost everything. 3 days before the event I didn't know existed. I stopped by a tailor shop near downtown Spokane to pick up a blazer I'd had altered for a work presentation. The shop was quiet that afternoon, and I was the only customer near the front counter when Ruth Ann Bellows walked in. Ruth Ann had been one of my mother's closest friends for as long as I could remember, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and showed up with food after a funeral before you even thought to ask. She smiled when she saw me, and we exchanged the usual pleasantries about the weather and how quickly the fall had come on this year. Then she tilted her head and asked with genuine warmth, "So what are you wearing Saturday? I imagine Marlene has the whole evening mapped out down to the centerpieces." I looked at her. Saturday. Her expression shifted just barely, just enough. She said something quickly about assuming I already knew all the details and changed the subject to her granddaughter's soccer tournament. By the time I walked out with my blazer, she was talking about something else entirely, and I was standing on the sidewalk in the October cold, trying to figure out what I had just missed. That evening, I opened Brielle's social media profile. Brielle Marston was Colton's fiancée, a woman I'd always found pleasant enough, though we were never particularly close. She ran the family's informal social media presence the way a marketing director runs a campaign, everything staged, everything captioned, everything designed to make their lives look as curated as a catalog shoot. She had deleted something recently. I could tell because there was a gap in her photo grid with the faint ghost of a removed image, and my notification history still held a fragment of it, a wide shot of an elegant venue interior, a banner that read, "40 years together." Tables set for well over 100 people, and in the center of the frame, my parents' names spelled out in tall gold letters. I sat with that image for a long time before I called my mother. Marlene picked up on the second ring. I kept my voice even when I asked her directly whether there was an event happening Saturday that I hadn't been told about. The silence on her end lasted long enough to answer the question before she said a single word. When she finally spoke, she confirmed it. The family had been planning a celebration for several months. A combined anniversary party and retirement dinner for my father. The Marigold Pavilion, a restored Art Deco theater on the river. Over 100 guests. Later, I would learn that in organizing the event, Colton had been coordinating with various city offices about the venue's public space permits, including a planning officer named Silas Keene, whose department handled that kind of administrative clearance. At the time, that name meant nothing to me. I had more immediate things to process. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked. She said the evening needed to maintain a certain kind of energy, that I had a tendency to raise concerns about finances, to ask questions about how much things cost, and whether certain decisions were practical, and that for this particular night, they needed everyone to simply be present and supportive without complications. Before I could respond, my father's voice came through in the background, and then he was on the line. He said this was his retirement, his and my mother's anniversary, and that he had worked too hard and waited too long for this night to have it turn into a debate. The plans were made. I told him I wasn't planning to debate anything. I told him I just wanted to be there as his daughter. My mother came back and said the seating had already been arranged, the catering numbers had been submitted, and an unexpected addition at this stage would create awkwardness for everyone. She said it gently in the tone she reserved for conversations she'd already decided the outcome of. And I understood then that this wasn't a miscommunication or a scheduling oversight. They had made a deliberate decision, planned it across months, coordinated it with Colton and Brielle and more than 100 other people, and at every step of that planning they had chosen not to include me. I thought about driving to the Marigold Pavilion on Saturday and walking in anyway. I thought about it seriously, standing in my kitchen that night with a cup of tea going cold on the counter. But I knew exactly how it would unfold. I would arrive uninvited to an event my family had specifically built around my absence, and before the night was over, I would become the story. The difficult daughter who couldn't let people have a moment without making it about herself. I wasn't going to give them that. The next morning I sent my father one message. "Hope tonight is everything you wanted." Then I called my manager and picked up an additional shift reviewing supplier contracts for a bridge construction project sitting in my queue. I needed to be somewhere that demanded my full attention, somewhere that wouldn't leave room for me to sit and think about the fact that my parents were hosting the event of their lives and had decided I was better left out of it. What I believed in those days leading up to Saturday was that the worst of what I was dealing with was emotional, that I had been excluded from something I should have been part of, and that it hurt the way most family betrayals hurt, quietly, deeply, in a place you don't really show anyone. I told myself I could move through it. I would work my shift, get through the weekend, and decide later what, if anything, I wanted to say to my family about all of it. I had no idea that while I was being erased from the guest list, my name was being written onto something else entirely. That while my mother was telling me there was no room for me at those tables, someone in my family had already decided I would pay for every single one of them. The Saturday of the celebration. I stayed at the office until well past 7 in the evening. I had brought a thermos of coffee and a stack of supplier contracts for the bridge project, and I worked through them the way I worked through most things that hurt, methodically, without stopping long enough to feel it too directly. The office building was nearly empty. The cleaning crew had come and gone on the floor below mine. Outside the windows, Spokane had gone dark and quiet, and somewhere across the city my parents were standing in a restored Art Deco theater on the river, surrounded by 100 people who had all been considered important enough to invite. I was reviewing a subcontractor clause when my phone rang at 7:40. The woman on the line identified herself as a representative from my bank's fraud detection department. She asked me to verify my identity, and then she asked in a careful and neutral tone whether I was currently at a venue called the Marigold Pavilion. I told her I was at my office on the 4th floor of a building downtown and that I had not authorized any charges to that venue. Then she began reading the transactions one by one. $11,800 for venue rental and stage equipment. $7,450 for a premium catered dinner. $3,600 for a live band and sound system. $2,900 for floral arrangements, lighting, and decor. $4,200 as a deposit on a luxury anniversary resort package. Over $1,500 for guest gifts and premium beverages. By the time she finished, the total came to just over $31,000. I reached into my bag and looked at my credit card. It was right there in its usual slot, exactly where it always was. I had not lost it. I had not lent it to anyone. I told her every one of those charges was unauthorized and asked her to lock the card immediately and flag all pending transactions. She confirmed the account was being frozen and that a formal fraud investigation would be opened. For a moment, I stood at my desk holding the card in my hand, staring at the familiar string of numbers. And then I remembered 9 months before this evening, in the dead of winter. The furnace at my parents' house had failed during a cold snap that dropped temperatures below freezing for nearly 2 weeks straight. My father told me their main account had a processing hold on it and asked if I could provide my card information over the phone so my mother could pay the heating repair company directly. I read the numbers to her while she wrote them down. A few weeks later, when I mentioned it in passing, she told me she had deleted the information from her notes once the payment cleared. I had believed her without question because it hadn't occurred to me not to. It occurred to me now. My phone rang again within minutes. The caller identified himself as Dean Mercer, the event director at the Marigold Pavilion. He said the primary payment method on file had just been declined and that he needed to reach the cardholder about an alternative form of payment before the venue could continue service past 9 o'clock. I told him I was the card holder, that I had not signed any contract, and that I had not authorized my card to be used for any event at his venue. Dean went quiet, and then I heard the sound of papers being moved on his end of the line. I told me the name on the booking was mine. My home address had been listed in the payment profile. The email address used for all correspondence was nearly identical to mine, off by a single character, a transposition so small it would be easy to miss at a glance. And my name appeared on 2 signed contracts in the form of an electronic signature. I asked Dean to preserve every document, every email exchange, and all security camera footage from that evening. He said he understood and would cooperate fully. The phone rang a 3rd time. It was Brielle. She didn't lead with a greeting. Her voice came through sharp and wound tight with anger that had been building well before it found somewhere to land. She said the band had stopped playing, the catering staff was refusing to open the dessert service, and the venue manager had just pulled Colton aside in front of half the guests. She told me I was humiliating the entire family in front of people my parents had known for decades. I told her as calmly as I could that I had not authorized any of the charges and that my card had been used without my knowledge or permission. I asked her how she thought the card information had been obtained. She didn't answer that. She said the whole night was falling apart and that I needed to fix it. Before I could respond, I heard the phone change hands. Then my father's voice came through low and clipped the way it got when he was angry, but holding on to the appearance of composure. He told me he knew exactly what I was doing, and that deliberately locking a card the moment he was about to give his retirement speech was one of the most calculated things I had ever done. I asked him one question: why was my card being used at an event I hadn't been invited to attend? There was a beat on his end, and then he said the charges were simply a form of family support, that I was in a position to contribute, and that everyone had assumed I would understand that. He said it like it was obvious. Like my objection to it was the strange part. My mother took the phone from him. She said they had known I would raise objections if they'd asked in advance, that I would have told them the event was too expensive, the venue too extravagant, that Colton's plans were impractical, and that they hadn't wanted to spend months defending every decision to me. They had needed the financial piece handled in a way that didn't become an argument. When I asked one more time why asking me wasn't an option, she said, and these were her exact words, "Because we already knew what you'd say." That sentence told me everything I hadn't fully understood until that moment. They hadn't excluded me to protect the atmosphere. They had excluded me because they knew I would never have agreed to pay for it, and they wanted the money without the conversation that would have come with asking. My absence wasn't a social decision. It was a financial strategy. I hung up, sat back down at my desk, and began building a different kind of file than the one I'd been working on all evening. I pulled up my text exchange with my mother from the previous winter, where she had confirmed she'd deleted my card details. I saved the fragment of Brielle's deleted post from my notification history. I went through 3 months of my own calendar to establish where I had been on every date corresponding to a vendor booking at the Marigold Pavilion. When you spend your professional life managing procurement, you understand that documentation is the only thing that holds when everything else is being contested. The following morning, my phone did not stop. My mother had called members of the extended family the same night the celebration fell apart, and by the time I woke up, her version of events had already spread. According to her, I had privately agreed to fund the celebration as a gift to the family, and then, out of anger over not being included on the guest list, revoked that support at the worst possible moment. My father had told a version to his former colleagues in which I had deliberately timed the card freeze to coincide with his step toward the microphone. Colton posted something vague on social media about people who would rather destroy a family's happiness than let someone else be in the spotlight. I did not respond publicly to any of it. I submitted everything I had gathered to the fraud investigator, my bank assigned to the case, my location records, my work calendar, the saved text messages, the captured image from Brielle's deleted post, a recording of the call in which my mother confirmed I had not been invited, and the contracts from the venue bearing a signature I had never produced. The investigator, a quiet and precise man named Gary, told me the case had several layers and would take time to work through properly. Within the first 2 weeks, the venue's security footage showed Colton meeting repeatedly with Dean Mercer to upgrade and expand the event's scope. Separate administrative records from the catering company showed my mother presenting a photographed image of my credit card on her phone to process a deposit. An email from my father to the venue's office specifically instructed them not to contact me directly because I was, as he had written, frequently traveling for work and has delegated all event logistics to the family. Gary also found the email address used to sign the contracts. It was not my address. It was one letter different. A transposition small enough to be invisible in a casual read, but deliberate enough to have been built that way intentionally. The account had been created the same month the venue booking began. Then Gary came across the private message thread between Brielle and Colton. In it, Brielle had asked whether I would receive automated transaction alerts if the deposits were processed in a certain way, a question that showed she knew my card was being used. But the thread also made clear she didn't know the full scope of what Colton had arranged. She had been given just enough information to be cautious, but not enough to fully understand what she was being pulled into. That distinction would matter both legally and to the people around her. It was during this stretch of the investigation that I spoke again with Silas Keene, the city planning officer, whose department had processed the public space permits for the event. Gary had reached out to his office for the administrative filings, and Silas called me directly to make sure I understood how those documents would factor into the process. It was a short call, professional and clear. He answered 2 questions I hadn't thought to ask yet, and when he hung up, I realized it was the first time in weeks that someone had called me simply to make sure I had what I needed, not to ask me for something, not to assign me blame. I didn't think much of it beyond that. But I didn't forget it either. What I was learning piece by piece was that this had not been an impulsive decision. It had been coordinated, planned across months with deliberate choices made at every stage. Someone had retained my card information. Someone had built a false email account. Someone had signed contracts under my name. And everyone in my immediate family had continued speaking to me throughout all of those months, saying nothing. The anger I felt was real. But underneath it was something quieter and more lasting, the understanding that I had spent years making myself available to this family, absorbing every financial gap and every crisis. And they had looked at all of that and decided the most useful thing about me was a 16-digit number they could use when I wasn't looking. 2 months after that, Saturday night by early December, Gary had walked me through the complete findings of the investigation. The bank's forensic team confirmed that the electronic signatures on both contracts had been generated from a device that was never in my possession. The false email account had been traced back to Colton. The text exchange where my mother told me she had deleted my card information sat directly alongside the evidence of her presenting that same card months later to process a catering deposit. When Gary finished, he said the evidence supported charges that could include identity theft, electronic fraud, and forgery of financial documents. Brielle's father, Elliot Marston, had learned about the investigation through his daughter, and what he found had blindsided him completely. He had believed all along that Douglas was funding the celebration out of his own retirement savings. When Elliot saw the message thread showing that Brielle had known my card was being used, even if she hadn't understood the full legal picture, he told her directly that the engagement needed to be suspended until the matter was resolved. Brielle, from what I heard through the limited channels still open between us, was furious at Colton in a way that had moved well past the legal exposure. She had trusted him with something significant, and he had used that trust to position her inside a situation she hadn't been given enough information to fully consent to. Meanwhile, the reputation my parents had spent decades building in Spokane was coming apart quietly and permanently. Several of my father's former colleagues withdrew from a group retirement gift organized in his honor. Ruth Ann called me not to gossip, but because she felt she owed me an honest conversation. She told me that months before the event, my mother had said something to her in passing that she hadn't known what to make of at the time, that Paige didn't need to be invited as long as she was still helping cover the costs. Ruth Ann said she had assumed it was a clumsy way of describing divided responsibilities, and she hadn't pushed further. She apologized for not pushing further. I told her I understood most people don't ask more questions because it's easier to accept the version that requires the least confrontation. Then, 1. Thursday evening in December. I heard a knock at my front door. I wasn't expecting it. When I looked through the window, I saw my father's car in the driveway, and I stood in the hallway for a long moment before I opened the door. All 3 of them were there, my father, my mother, and Colton. My father had his hands in the pockets of his coat. My mother looked like she hadn't been sleeping. Colton stood slightly behind them both, which was unusual for someone who normally positioned himself at the center of any room he walked into. I let them in because I thought in that first moment that they had come to say the thing that needed to be said. I thought this was what an apology looked like before it started. The showing up, the standing in someone's hallway, the faces that finally looked like they understood the weight of what had happened. I was wrong about that too. My father sat on the edge of the couch and talked about the legal fees. He said the attorney they'd retained had given them a number that neither he nor my mother could absorb on a fixed retirement income, and that the exposure across all 3 of them was significant enough to affect their housing situation. My mother talked about her health. The stress of the past 2 months had worsened her blood pressure. Her doctor had adjusted her medication twice, and people at her church had started treating her differently. She said she had spent 40 years building a life in this community and didn't know who she was in it anymore. Then Colton said that Brielle was going to leave him. He said it plainly without the usual layer of deflection he used when things were his fault. He said the only thing that could possibly give him a chance to fix it was if the legal situation went away. What they were asking me to do, my father finally laid out, was to tell the investigator that I had verbally agreed to sponsor the celebration as a gift to the family. That locking the card had been an emotional reaction to finding out I wasn't included, not a report of unauthorized use. That the electronic signatures, while not produced by me directly, had been created with my implied consent, because I had trusted them to handle the logistics. In exchange, my father said they would put a repayment plan in writing over several years until the full $31,000 was returned to me. I let him finish. Then I asked them one question. If the bank hadn't called that night, I said, would any of you have ever told me that my card paid for that event? Nobody answered. My father looked at the floor. My mother turned her head slightly toward the window. Colton pressed his hands together between his knees and said nothing at all. I asked a second question, whether at any point during months of planning anyone had considered sending me a late invitation, even a token one, even something that would have let me stand next to my father for an hour while he gave his speech. My mother was the one who finally answered. She said they couldn't have done that because if I had been present, guests would have assumed I had organized or funded the evening, and all the credit, the scale, the elegance, the attention to detail would have naturally shifted toward me. She said they had worked too hard on it to have the conversation become about what Paige had contributed. That was the last piece I hadn't fully understood until she said it out loud. They hadn't just wanted my money. They had wanted the result of my money while making sure my name was nowhere near it publicly. I was supposed to fund image and then disappear from the frame entirely so that the image could belong to someone else. I told them I would not be changing my statement to the investigator. I said that a good daughter wasn't someone who lied to protect her parents from the legal consequences of crimes they had committed deliberately and with planning. They had months of opportunities to ask me to include me, to be honest about what they needed, and at every one of those moments, they had chosen a different path. That path had led them here, and I wasn't going to erase the road for them. My father said I was being cold. Cold, I told him, is planning a family celebration with your daughter's money and then deciding she wasn't worth an invitation to walk through the door. I didn't say anything after that. I told them that any further communication needed to go through my attorney, and I walked them to the door. When it closed, I stood in the hallway in the quiet and felt the specific weight of having done something that couldn't be undone. I wasn't relieved yet, but I had not collapsed, and that felt like something real. The investigation concluded in late winter. The findings established clearly what each person had done. My mother had retained my card information without authorization. Colton had created the false email account and signed contracts under my name. My father had communicated with the venue in ways designed to prevent me from being notified or consulted. All three signed a repayment agreement with the bank and the vendors, and each faced legal consequences proportionate to their role. My father lost his honorary position with the Retired Employees Association at his former company. Colton sold his car and shut down the online business he'd been running at a loss for most of a year. The bank restored my credit record completely and cleared every fraudulent charge. Brielle ended the engagement. It wasn't purely the legal situation that decided it. It was the realization that Colton had known at multiple points that she was being positioned in a way that could have implicated her, and he had never given her enough of the truth to protect herself. She deserved better than that, and it seemed she finally knew it. I changed everything that could be changed. New card, new account numbers, a credit freeze, updated passwords, a new email address that no one in my family had access to. I removed my parents from my emergency contacts and from the financial documents where they had been listed as references. I did all of this without anger, in the same methodical way I approached anything that required my full attention. It was not an act of punishment. It was the maintenance you do when you finally accept that a system has been compromised, and continuing to use it unchanged would be its own kind of negligence. Silas and I had our first real conversation, not about permits or case documentation, a few weeks after the investigation wrapped up. He had sent a brief message asking whether everything had resolved to my satisfaction, and I wrote back something longer than I intended to. We started talking the way people sometimes do when they've been introduced through a difficult situation and find on the other side of it that they actually want to keep talking. He asked about my work about the bridge project, about what it felt like to manage contracts for infrastructure that would outlast the people who built it. We disagreed about a few things in ways that made the conversation more interesting, not less. What I noticed early on was that Silas was not drawn to me because I was useful to him. He was curious about the way I thought, and he said so directly, which was more disarming than I expected. By spring, I had also built something else, a smaller, quieter version of the kind of community I'd always told myself I didn't need. A colleague named Dana, who had been through her own version of a family financial crisis and understood the specific exhaustion of it without requiring me to explain every layer. Two neighbors who had been friendly for years and became genuinely close after I stopped spending every free weekend managing someone else's emergencies. People who showed up not because I was capable of solving things for them, but because they simply wanted to be around me. A year after the night the bank called, I was promoted to Regional Director of Procurement. I marked it with a small dinner in my backyard. 8 people, a long table, good food, nothing elaborate. Silas was there. Dana was there. The neighbors brought wine and stayed later than anyone expected. At some point in the evening, Silas raised his glass and said something simple about the kind of person who builds things carefully and makes them last. I didn't make a speech. I just looked around the table at the people who had come because they wanted to be there, not because I had paid for their seat, not because I was solving something for them, and I understood in a way I hadn't before what it felt like to take up exactly the right amount of space. My parents sent a card. It arrived the week before the dinner with both their names signed at the bottom and no requests enclosed. I read it, set it on the counter, and went back to what I was doing. I didn't know yet whether the distance between us would ever close. I wasn't forcing myself to have an answer. What I knew was that forgiveness, if it came, would be something I arrived at on my own terms, not something extracted from me under pressure, and not something that came with a cost I hadn't agreed to pay. I used to believe that being needed was the same as being valued, that if I kept showing up, kept handling things, kept saying yes every time someone called, I was earning my place in my own family. The night the bank called took that belief apart completely. And in the space where it used to be something more honest, grew the understanding that belonging shouldn't require a transaction, that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who would never think to charge you for the privilege of staying. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the one people called when things fell apart, the one who paid in ways no one acknowledged, the one who was left out of the celebration but never left off the bill, I hope this reminded you that your value is not measured by what you're willing to absorb. You are allowed to stop paying for a seat at a table that was never really yours to begin with. And if these are the kinds of stories that stay with you, I'd love for you to subscribe. There are more coming, and every single one is about someone who finally decided that enough was enough.